This Beverly Hills fashion model claimed she died on the operating table and was given a choice by cloaked figures in heaven, but what she discovered about her husband's murderous plot would change everything. After 17 years strutting down the world's most prestigious catwalks, Diane Sherman's near-death experience revealed dark secrets that would shake the foundations of both Hollywood's elite and her own faith. The former pastor's daughter says she was shown visions of unconditional love and forgiveness, only to return and uncover a sinister insurance fraud scheme targeting vulnerable women in the modeling industry. From the glittering runways of Paris to a Mexican beach where her husband tried to drown her, this is more than just another model's story. It's a tale of betrayal, redemption, and divine intervention that will leave you questioning everything you believe about life after death. Now, I'll share this remarkable journey in her own words. The spotlights felt unusually harsh that evening at the Beverly Hills Fashion Week. As I took my final steps down the runway in a $50,000 Oscar de la Renta gown, something felt terribly wrong. My heart was racing, but not from the usual pre-show jitters. The faces in the front row began to blur, merging into a sea of indistinct features. I could hear whispers from the crowd, see the flashbulbs popping, but everything seemed to be happening in slow motion. The last thing I remember was catching my reflection in the mirrored backdrop. I looked like a ghost in white silk. Then, as if someone had pulled a plug, the lights started to fade. I tried to maintain my runway smile, but my legs gave way. The last sound I heard was the collective gasp of the audience as my body crumpled onto the pristine white runway, the expensive fabric billowing around me like a shroud. "Diane, wake up! Diane, wake up!" The voices seemed to be coming from somewhere far away. I felt strangely peaceful, floating above the chaos below. It took me a moment to realize I was looking down at my own body, surrounded by paramedics in the backstage area. My friend Sarah was crying, mascara streaming down her face as she clutched my discarded heel. The strangest part, I felt no connection to the lifeless figure they were working on. The woman on the floor was just a shell, a designer dress now cut open as they attempted CPR. I wanted to tell them I was fine, that I had never felt more alive, but my voice wouldn't reach them. As the emergency lights flashed red and blue, casting eerie shadows on the walls, I began to understand this wasn't just another fashion show drama. This was the moment I died. I was born into what most people would consider a charmed life in Beverly Hills, California, but beneath the polished surface of luxury cars, country club memberships, and society photographs lay a world of silent pain that would shape my entire existence. My father, Reverend Thomas Sherman, wasn't always the angry, bitter man who terrorized our family dinners with drunken rages. In my earliest memories, he stood tall and proud behind the pulpit of Beverly Hills' most prestigious church, his voice resonating with passion as he preached about God's unconditional love. The congregation adored him, never suspecting that their charismatic pastor was slowly losing his faith after witnessing too many wealthy parishioners use religion as a social stepping stone rather than a path to genuine spirituality. The breaking point came when I was 8. A scandal involving church funds and several prominent members of the congregation destroyed my father's reputation and his faith simultaneously. He resigned from the ministry, turned to drinking, and our family's picture-perfect facade began to crack. My mother, Eleanor, responded by doubling down on appearances, desperately trying to maintain our social standing while teaching my sister Catherine and me that fear was our most reliable companion. "Always smile in public, darling," she would say, fixing my hair before another society photography session. "No one needs to know what happens behind closed doors." Those words became my mantra, even as I heard my father's angry shouts echo through our mansion's carefully decorated halls at night. Catherine and I developed what Mother called an unfortunate sensitivity, though looking back I recognize it as a gift. We could sense impending disasters before they happened, sharing knowing looks across the dinner table moments before Father's temper would explode. We communicated without words, finding solace in our shared understanding of the darkness that lurked beneath our privileged existence. The ultimate irony was the dollhouse, a complete children's boutique that my mother had craned into our backyard, transforming it into what she called our private paradise. It was a miniature version of perfection, every detail meticulously curated. But like everything else in our lives, it was just another elaborate prop in the performance of happiness we were required to maintain. I attended the most exclusive all-girls school in Beverly Hills, where I learned to perfect the art of appearing flawless while feeling fundamentally flawed. When I missed nearly my entire junior year due to stress-induced illness, Mother's solution wasn't rest or therapy, it was a debutante presentation in Vienna. Better to be admired from afar than understood up close, she would say, adjusting my white gown before I curtsied to European royalty. The psychic sensitivity that Catherine and I shared intensified during my teenage years. I could walk into a room and immediately feel the weight of unspoken tensions, sense the sadness behind forced smiles, and recognize the familiar strain of people pretending to be something they weren't. It was both a blessing and a curse. I understood others deeply, but found it increasingly difficult to maintain the facade my mother had so carefully constructed. Perhaps that's why modeling felt like a natural progression. After all, I'd been posing for society photographs since I could walk. The camera didn't care about the trembling beneath my smile or the emptiness behind my eyes. In front of the lens, I could be whoever people wanted me to be, the ultimate expression of the lesson I'd learned at home: appearance is everything, authenticity nothing. But even as I ascended the ranks of the fashion world, that little girl who used to hide in her elaborate dollhouse was still there, wondering if anyone would ever see past the perfect surface to the frightened soul beneath. What I didn't know then was that it would take literally dying on a runway to finally break free from the golden cage of expectations that Beverly Hills had built around me. By 21, I had graced the covers of every major fashion magazine, but the reflection staring back at me felt like a stranger. I was living the dream that thousands of young girls would kill for, yet each flash of the camera seemed to strip away another piece of my soul. The modeling world, with its brutal standards and cutthroat competition, was the perfect extension of my Beverly Hills upbringing, all surface, no substance. That's when I met James Winters. He was a rising star in fashion photography, known for capturing what he called the soul behind the smile. The irony of that statement would only become clear years later. At first, he seemed different from the other industry vultures. He took time to talk to me between shots, asked about my thoughts rather than just directing my poses. When he proposed after a whirlwind 6-month romance, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw the real me. Our wedding was a society spectacle, the kind my mother had been preparing me for my entire life. Eleanor Sherman finally had something genuine to smile about as Women's Wear daily chronicled every detail of the ceremony. James looked perfect in his designer tuxedo, and I floated down the aisle in a custom Vera Wang gown, the embodiment of a fairy tale ending. If anyone noticed how my father's hands shook as he walked me down the aisle, that they were too polite to mention it. The first few years of marriage were a masterclass in maintaining appearances. We were the golden couple of the fashion world, the celebrated photographer and his muse. Our Bel Air mansion was featured in Architectural Digest, our dinner parties were the talk of the industry, and our public displays of affection made regular appearances in the gossip columns. But behind closed doors, the familiar emptiness grew larger. James was obsessed with his work, spending endless hours in his dark room developing photos of other women while I wandered our perfectly decorated rooms like a ghost. When I tried to talk to him about having children, he would deflect, saying we needed to focus on our careers. "You're at your peak," he would say, examining contact sheets without looking at me. "Why would you want to ruin that with pregnancy?" I threw myself deeper into my work, walking runways across the globe. Paris, Milan, London, the cities began to blur together, each fashion week feeling more hollow than the last. The other models called me Ice Queen for my ability to remain perfectly composed under pressure, never knowing that I'd been trained for this performance since childhood. My sister Catherine saw through it all. During one of our late-night phone calls, she said something that chilled me to the bone. "Diane, he doesn't look at you the way a photographer should. He looks at you the way a collector looks at his prize acquisition." But I dismissed her concerns, just as I'd been taught to dismiss any uncomfortable truths that threatened the perfect picture. The modeling agencies loved my reliability, my professional detachment. "Diane never causes drama," they would tell clients. "She's always exactly what you need her to be." Each compliment felt like another brick in the wall I'd built around my true self. I was approaching 30, ancient by industry standards, but my ability to maintain the facade made me invaluable. What no one knew was that every night I would lock myself in our marble bathroom and cry silently, pressing my fists against my mouth to muffle the sounds. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, beautiful, successful, envied, and completely empty inside. I had everything my mother had ever wanted for me, everything society said should make me happy, but the void within only grew deeper. I didn't know then that James was orchestrating the greatest facade of all. While I was perfecting my runway walk, he was perfecting a plan that would turn our fashion fairy tale into a nightmare. But sometimes, as my sister and I had learned in our haunted childhood home, the greatest dangers aren't the ones that announce themselves with screams and crashes. They're the ones that smile at you across the breakfast table, planning your destruction with the same careful precision used to frame a perfect photograph. By 21, I had graced the covers of every major fashion magazine, but the reflection staring back at me felt like a stranger. I was living the dream that thousands of young girls would kill for, yet each flash of the camera seemed to strip away another piece of my soul. The modeling world, with its brutal standards and cutthroat competition, was the perfect extension of my Beverly Hills upbringing, all surface, no substance. That's when I met James Winters. He was a rising star in fashion photography, known for capturing what he called the soul behind the smile. The irony of that statement would only become clear years later. At first, he seemed different from the other industry vultures. He took time to talk to me between shots, asked about my thoughts rather than just directing my poses. When he proposed after a whirlwind 6-month romance, I thought I'd finally found someone who saw the real me. Our wedding was a society spectacle, the kind my mother had been preparing me for my entire life. Eleanor Sherman finally had something genuine to smile about as Women's Wear daily chronicled every detail of the ceremony. James looked perfect in his designer tuxedo, and I floated down the aisle in a custom Vera Wang gown, the embodiment of a fairy tale ending. If anyone noticed how my father's hands shook as he walked me down the aisle, they were too polite to mention it. The first few years of marriage were a masterclass in maintaining appearances. We were the golden couple of the fashion world, the celebrated photographer and his muse. Our Bel Air mansion was featured in Architectural Digest, our dinner parties were the talk of the industry, and our public displays of affection made regular appearances in the gossip columns. But behind closed doors, the familiar emptiness grew larger. James was obsessed with his work, spending endless hours in his darkroom developing photos of other women while I wandered our perfectly decorated rooms like a ghost. When I tried to talk to him about having children, he would deflect, saying we needed to focus on our careers. "You're at your peak," he would say, examining contact sheets without looking at me. "Why would you want to ruin that with pregnancy?" I threw myself deeper into my work, walking runways across the globe. Paris, Milan, London, the cities began to blur together, each fashion week feeling more hollow than the last. The other models called me Ice Queen for my ability to remain perfectly composed under pressure, never knowing that I'd been trained for this performance since childhood. My sister Catherine saw through it all. During one of our late-night phone calls, she said something that chilled me to the bone. "Diane, he doesn't look at you the way a photographer should. He looks at you the way a collector looks at his prize acquisition." But I dismissed her concerns, just as I'd been taught to dismiss any uncomfortable truths that threatened the perfect picture. The modeling agencies loved my reliability, my professional detachment. "Diane never causes drama," they would tell clients. "She's always exactly what you need her to be." Each compliment felt like another brick in the wall I'd built around my true self. I was approaching 30, ancient by industry standards, but my ability to maintain the facade made me invaluable. What no one knew was that every night I would lock myself in our marble bathroom and cry silently, pressing my fists against my mouth to muffle the sounds. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, beautiful, successful, envied, and completely empty inside. I had everything my mother had ever wanted for me, everything society said should make me happy, but the void within only grew deeper. I didn't know then that James was orchestrating the greatest facade of all. While I was perfecting my runway walk, he was perfecting a plan that would turn our fashion fairy tale into a nightmare. But sometimes, as my sister and I had learned in our haunted childhood home, the greatest dangers aren't the ones that announce themselves with screams and crashes. They're the ones that smile at you across the breakfast table, planning your destruction with the same careful precision used to frame a perfect photograph. The months following the Mexico incident unfolded like scenes from a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My knee injury meant I couldn't walk the runway, and for the first time in my life I was forced to be still, to sit with my thoughts. It was during this period of enforced reflection that the carefully constructed facade of my marriage began to crumble. Sarah Mason had been my best friend since my early modeling days. She was the one person in the industry I trusted completely, the shoulder I cried on after fights with James, the confidante who knew about my father's alcoholism and my mother's emotional manipulation. So when I discovered her friendship had been yet another carefully crafted illusion, the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. I found the evidence in James's darkroom while searching for my insurance papers. Hidden behind his prized collection of vintage cameras was a stack of intimate photographs, Sarah and James together, dating back 3 years. But it wasn't just the affair that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the photos were documents, a $10 million life insurance policy on me, taken out just weeks before our Mexico trip, and emails between them discussing what they called the plan. That same week I discovered I was pregnant. The cruel irony of carrying a child while uncovering the depths of my husband's betrayal was almost too much to bear. When I called my mother, seeking some fragment of maternal comfort, she was more concerned about the scandal potential than my emotional state. "Think of how this will look," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We need to manage this carefully." But fate wasn't done with me yet. The morning I planned to confront James about Sarah, I received the call that my mother had suffered a massive stroke. I rushed to the hospital, still limping from my knee injury, to find her unable to speak or move. The doctors said the stress of maintaining appearances had literally killed her. As I sat by her hospital bed, watching her slip away, I realized I was watching the death of more than just my mother. It was the death of everything I'd been raised to believe about life, love, and what truly matters. The day after my mother's funeral, James asked for a divorce. He didn't know about my pregnancy, and I chose not to tell him. Sarah had already left Los Angeles, supposedly for a modeling contract in Europe. I learned later they had planned to reunite once James collected on my life insurance policy. Their plan had failed in Mexico, but they had backup scenarios ready, each one designed to look like a tragic accident. I found myself at 32, pregnant, divorced, and motherless. The modeling agencies that had once celebrated me now treated me like damaged goods. My knee injury had left me with a slight limp that was career-ending by industry standards. The press, always hungry for scandal, painted me as a bitter ex-wife, unable to accept that my husband had found love with a younger woman. But amid this darkness, a tiny spark of life grew inside me. My daughter, conceived in the midst of betrayal but carrying none of its taint, became my anchor to reality. The first time I felt her kick, I was sitting in my therapist's office, finally telling the full story of the Mexico incident. That small flutter of life reminded me that even in our darkest moments, hope finds a way to break through. Catherine moved in with me, leaving her successful real estate career in New York to help her broken sister rebuild. We converted my Bel Air mansion, the one Architectural Digest had once fawned over, into a simpler space, stripping away the pretense and keeping only what felt authentic. At night we would sit in what used to be James's darkroom, now transformed into a nursery, and plan for a future neither of us could clearly see. Sometimes, Catherine said one evening, you have to let everything fall apart to see what's truly worth putting back together. My daughter Sarah was born on a clear Los Angeles morning, her first cry piercing through the carefully maintained quiet of Cedars-Sinai's VIP maternity ward. She was perfect, all rosy cheeks and tiny fingers, untouched by the darkness that had preceded her arrival. For 6 blissful months, she was my reason for everything, my proof that beauty could emerge from betrayal. Then came the morning I noticed the bruises. At first, the pediatrician dismissed them as normal baby bumps, but Catherine's intuition, the same one that had warned me about James, pushed us to seek more opinions. After weeks of tests and specialists, the diagnosis hit like a thunderbolt: a rare blood disorder, one that required immediate and aggressive treatment. The medical bills mounted quickly, devouring my modeling savings. James, who had moved to Europe with Sarah by then, ignored my attempts to contact him for help. The insurance companies found every possible loophole to deny coverage, citing pre-existing conditions and policy limitations. Each denial letter felt like another nail in the coffin of my former life. One particularly bad night, after Sarah's 3rd blood transfusion, I found myself in the hospital chapel. It wasn't the fashionable church of my childhood, where appearance mattered more than faith. This was a simple room, its wooden pews worn smooth by thousands of desperate prayers. I hadn't prayed since discovering my husband's betrayal. It felt hypocritical to seek divine help after years of superficial faith. But that night, watching my baby daughter fight for her life, I fell to my knees. "Please," I whispered, my designer dress crumpled on the chapel floor. "I don't care about anything else anymore. Take my beauty, take my career, take everything, just save her." The silence that followed was deafening, but something shifted inside me. For the first time in my life, I had voiced a completely honest prayer. The next morning, my father showed up at the hospital. We hadn't spoken since Mother's funeral, where he'd been too drunk to deliver the eulogy. But now he stood in the doorway of Sarah's room, sober and clutching a worn Bible. "I've been a terrible father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let me try to be a better grandfather." His presence brought an unexpected peace. Between treatments, he would read to Sarah from his Bible, his former preacher's voice giving strength to ancient words of comfort. I watched my father rediscover his faith as he prayed over my daughter's hospital bed, and something of my own childhood faith began to stir. It was during this time that my knee, the one injured in Mexico, began causing unbearable pain. The doctors discovered that the original injury had never properly healed, masked by years of painkillers and determination. Surgery was needed, but I resisted. How could I think about myself when Sarah needed me? Catherine, always my voice of reason, finally intervened. "You can't take care of her if you can't walk," she said, showing me how my limping had become worse. "Maybe this is God telling you to finally deal with all your old wounds, not just the physical ones." The decision to have surgery came after a particularly powerful moment in Sarah's hospital room. I had been reading her a story when she looked up at me with those innocent eyes and said, "Mommy, Jesus told me you need to fix your ouchie too." Coming from my 4-year-old daughter, those words carried more weight than any medical advice. The night before my scheduled surgery, I dreamt of the Mexican beach where James had tried to kill me. But this time, instead of feeling terror as the waves pulled me under, I felt a strange sense of peace. In the dream, a bright light cut through the dark water, and a voice that reminded me of my father in his preaching days said, "It's time to let go of the old wounds." I woke up knowing something significant was about to happen. Catherine felt it too. That same shared sensitivity we'd had since childhood was practically humming between us. As the nurses prepared me for surgery, I caught a glimpse of myself in the medical bay window. The former ice queen of the fashion world was gone, replaced by someone both weaker and stronger, a mother who had learned that true beauty has nothing to do with appearances. The last thing I remember before the anesthesia took hold was my father's voice, clear and strong like in his preaching days, reading from Psalms, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." I squeezed Catherine's hand, looked at Sarah sleeping peacefully in her wheelchair beside my bed, and surrendered to whatever was coming next. The operating room was colder than I expected, or maybe it was just my nerves. The anesthesiologist had seemed concerned about my low body weight. Years of modeling habits die hard, but proceeded after I signed additional consent forms. I remember the mask being placed over my face, the counting backward, and then ... something entirely different from ordinary unconsciousness. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I heard voices shouting, "Diane, wake up. Diane, wake up," but they seemed distant, as if coming through water. I tried to tell them I was fine, that they must have the wrong patient, but my voice made no sound. That's when I realized I was looking down at my own body on the operating table, watching the medical team working frantically to revive me. The scene was surreal. My physical form lay there, pale and lifeless, while I felt more vibrantly alive than ever before. The surgeons' movements seemed to slow, their voices becoming muffled as I drifted higher into the corner of the room. I could see everything with perfect clarity, the monitors flashing red, the nurses running in with crash carts, my father and Catherine pacing in the waiting room down the hall, and little Sarah sleeping peacefully in her wheelchair, unaware that her mother's soul was no longer tethered to earth. Suddenly I was pulled through what felt like a tunnel of darkness. The same darkness I had feared as a child now felt welcoming, peaceful. As I moved through it, every betrayal, every pain, every moment of my life seemed to flash before me, not in judgment, but in understanding. I saw James plotting with Sarah, but instead of anger, I felt compassion for their twisted souls. I saw my mother's desperate attempts to maintain appearances and finally understood her own deep fears. Then the darkness gave way to light, but not ordinary light. It was alive, pulsing with colors I had no words for, radiating a love so profound it made every earthly emotion seem pale in comparison. Within this light I encountered beings that my mind interpreted as monks in brown robes, though I sensed this was just my brain's attempt to make sense of something far beyond human comprehension. They stood in 2 rows, creating a path before me. As I moved between them, I felt their love and wisdom washing over me in waves. Each one seemed to hold a piece of universal truth, offering understanding without words. At the end of their formation stood one who seemed different, more radiant, more present. This being spoke not with words, but directly to my soul. The message was clear: you cannot stay. It's not your time. But I resisted. How could I go back to a world of pain and betrayal after experiencing such perfect love? Here finally was the acceptance and peace I'd sought my entire life. Here was true beauty, not the shallow reflection I'd chased through my modeling career. The being showed me visions: Sarah growing up without a mother, turning bitter like James; Catherine losing her faith, drowning in grief; my father returning to alcohol, never completing his journey of redemption. But more than these potential futures, I was shown my purpose, the souls I was meant to help, the healing I was meant to facilitate, the love I was meant to share. You have a gift, the being communicated. Your suffering has prepared you to understand others' pain. Your healing will enable you to help heal them. Images flashed before me: women escaping abusive relationships, children finding hope in darkness, souls reconnecting with their divine essence. I saw myself establishing a healing center, using my newfound understanding to guide others toward light. Most powerfully, I was shown Sarah's complete healing, not just her physical illness, but her spirit becoming a beacon for others. But this future would only unfold if I chose to return to face the challenges ahead with my new understanding of divine love. The choice had to be mine. The beings made that clear. I could stay in this realm of perfect love and peace, or return to a world of duality and pain, but with the power to transform that pain into purpose. As I wavered, feeling torn between heaven and earth, Sarah's face appeared before me. Not her physical face, but her soul's essence, shining with the same divine light that surrounded me. In that moment, I understood that love, real love, not the conditional kind I'd known in Beverly Hills, sometimes means choosing the harder path. With this realization, I felt myself being drawn back, passing again through the tunnel of darkness, but this time carrying a spark of that divine light within me. The return to my body was violent, like being plunged into ice water. I heard the medical team's shocked voices as my heart began beating again, felt the cold rush of revival medications in my veins. But I also felt something else, a permanent connection to that realm of light, a channel of divine love that would never close. Opening my eyes in the recovery room was like being born again. Every sensation was heightened: the rough texture of the hospital sheets, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the fluorescent lights that seemed to pulse with an energy I'd never noticed before. But most striking was my newfound awareness of the emotions filling the room, as tangible to me now as physical objects. I could feel Catherine's relief washing over me in warm waves before she even entered the room. My father's presence came next, his energy a complex mixture of joy and lingering guilt. But it was little Sarah's aura that nearly overwhelmed me, pure, radiant love unmarred by earthly concerns, so similar to the divine light I'd experienced in my near-death state. The doctors called my recovery miraculous. My vital signs had stabilized faster than they could explain, and the chronic pain in my knee had mysteriously vanished. What they couldn't see were the profound changes happening beneath the surface. Every person who entered my hospital room carried their own story of pain and hope, which I could now read as clearly as words on a page. The first incident happened with my night nurse, Maria. As she checked my vitals, I found myself speaking words that seemed to come from somewhere beyond me. Your son is going to be fine. The doctors will find the right treatment next week. She stared at me, shocked she hadn't told anyone on staff about her child's illness. 2 weeks later, she returned to tell me I had been right. The doctors had discovered a new treatment protocol that was working. Similar experiences followed. I would touch someone's hand and know their deepest fears, their unspoken pain. Sometimes words of comfort or guidance would flow through me as if that divine light I'd encountered was using me as a channel. Other times, a simple touch would trigger physical healing in ways medical science couldn't explain. Sarah's recovery was the most profound testament to this transformation. During one of our nightly cuddle sessions in my hospital bed, I felt that familiar divine energy flowing through me into her tiny body. The next morning, her blood tests showed dramatic improvement. Within weeks, her mysterious blood disorder had completely disappeared, leaving her doctors baffled but her mother knowing exactly what had happened. But these gifts came with challenges. The first time I went to a restaurant after my recovery, I nearly collapsed from the overwhelming flood of emotions and energies from other diners. Learning to manage these new sensitivities was like learning to walk again, each step careful and deliberate. Catherine became my anchor, helping me develop techniques to shield myself when the input became too intense. My father watched these changes with a mixture of wonder and recognition. One evening, as we sat in the hospital garden during my recovery, he confessed that he'd experienced similar insights during his early days as a minister, before fear and doubt had driven him to bottle them up with alcohol. Maybe, he said, his eyes clear and present, God had to break us both to remake us. The fashion world, predictably, had no framework for understanding my transformation. Former colleagues whispered about post-traumatic stress and nervous breakdowns. My modeling agency gently suggested I seek psychiatric help when I tried to explain my new perspectives on beauty and authenticity. But for the first time in my life, their opinions held no power over me. Instead, I found myself drawn to people in pain, the ones society usually overlooks. During my hospital stays, I would wander the halls against medical advice, drawn to rooms where the suffering was most acute. Sometimes just my presence seemed to bring peace. Other times, the divine guidance that now flowed through me would provide exactly the words or touch needed for healing. The most unexpected change was in how I saw myself. The mirror no longer showed me flaws to be corrected or an image to be maintained. Instead, I saw myself as I had appeared in that realm of light, a soul temporarily housed in a body, here for a divine purpose. The face that had graced so many magazine covers now seemed like a distant memory, belonging to someone else's story. Sarah, with a child's natural acceptance of miracles, adapted to these changes effortlessly. She would often see the same auras I did, pointing out the pretty colors around people or knowing when someone needed a hug. Her own healing had awakened something in her, as if our shared experience had opened a channel between mother and daughter that transcended ordinary bonds. My emergence as a healer did not come without its share of controversy and opposition. The transformation of Diane Sherman from international fashion model to spiritual healer attracted attention from both devotees and skeptics. The Los Angeles Times ran a scathing piece titled "From Runway to Reiki, a Model's Midlife Crisis," which painted me as a desperate fallen star seeking new relevance. The medical establishment was particularly hostile. When patients began crediting me with their miraculous recoveries, several prominent doctors launched a campaign to discredit my work. They called it dangerous pseudoscience, warning that I was giving false hope to desperate people. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, head of neurology at Cedars-Sinai, publicly challenged me to prove my abilities under laboratory conditions, calling my near-death experience a simple case of anesthesia-induced hallucination. Even the religious community was divided. Some churches embraced my story as a modern-day miracle, while others condemned my work as blasphemous. My father's former congregation split over the issue, with longtime members taking sides. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had driven my father from his ministry were now debating the legitimacy of his daughter's divine gift. The most painful opposition came from unexpected quarters. Sarah Mason, my former best friend and James's accomplice, resurfaced with a tell-all-book deal. Beautiful Lies: The True Story of Diane Sherman promised to expose me as a manipulative fraud who had fabricated my near-death experience to cover up my mental breakdown. The fact that she was profiting from her own betrayal made the wound even deeper. Personal attacks began to affect my family. Sarah was bullied at school by children whose parents had read tabloid stories about her crazy mother. Catherine lost clients in her real estate business, with some explicitly citing their discomfort with her sister's occult practices. My father, finally sober and rebuilding his life, faced whispers and stares at his AA meetings. The pressure reached its peak when the California Medical Board launched an investigation into my healing practice. They claimed I was practicing medicine without a license, though I had never claimed to be a doctor or charged for my gift. The investigation forced me to shut down the small healing room I'd established in my home, where I'd been helping people free of charge. Yet amidst these challenges, remarkable things continued to happen. A teenage girl with terminal cancer went into unexpected remission after spending time with me. A war veteran's PTSD symptoms disappeared following our session. A young mother's chronic pain condition resolved itself after I shared my story with her. These miracles couldn't be explained away by skeptics, yet they also couldn't be replicated on demand for scientific studies. The most difficult aspect was maintaining my connection to the divine light while under constant attack. The sensitivity that allowed me to feel others' pain also made me vulnerable to their hatred and doubt. There were nights when I questioned everything, wondering if I should have stayed in that realm of perfect love instead of returning to this world of duality and judgment. Catherine became my rock during these times, reminding me of the bigger picture. "Remember what they showed you," she would say, referring to my visions during the near-death experience. "This resistance is part of the path." She was right. Each challenge was forcing me to strengthen my faith, to trust the divine guidance even when the human world rejected it. Sarah, now fully recovered, showed wisdom beyond her years. One evening, after a particularly harsh TV expose about me, she crawled into my lap and said, "Mommy, the angels say we shouldn't worry about what people think. They say we should just keep loving." Out of the mouths of babes came the perfect reminder of my true purpose. My father, too, found his voice again. Drawing on his past as a minister, he began speaking out about the relationship between traditional faith and spiritual healing. His testimony carried weight with religious communities, helping bridge the gap between orthodox beliefs and the broader spirituality I now embodied. Through it all, I held on to the truth of my experience, that divine love that transcended all earthly understanding. Each skeptic's attack, each legal challenge, each betrayal only served to strengthen my resolve. I began to understand that these obstacles weren't just tests of my faith, they were opportunities to demonstrate the very unconditional love I had encountered in my near-death experience. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing. James had finally returned to the United States, forced by an international investigation into insurance fraud. He sat at the defendant's table, still handsome in his Italian suit. But I could now see the darkness clouding his aura, a murky swirl of fear, anger, and desperation. Sarah Mason sat beside him, her once familiar face now a mask of practiced innocence. The prosecution had offered her immunity in exchange for testimony about James's pattern of marrying and attempting to kill wealthy women for their insurance money. I was, they discovered, his third target, but the first to survive. The evidence was damning. The detective who had investigated the Mexico incident presented newly discovered photos from James's hidden archive, sequential shots of my struggling in the water, meticulously documented as if for an art exhibition. Each click of his camera had captured his attempt to murder me, transformed into a twisted form of performance art. But the most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. A young woman named Rachel Bennett approached me outside the courtroom during a recess. She was trembling as she introduced herself as James's assistant from his dark room. "I've been carrying this burden for years," she said, handing me a USB drive. "He made me edit these photos, remove the rope, enhance the wave patterns. He said it was for an art installation about drowning, but I always knew something was wrong." The USB contained not only the original unedited photos from Mexico, but also detailed plans for what James called his final masterpiece, my death on the operating table. He had researched my surgery extensively, planning to exploit my low body weight and anxiety to create the perfect circumstances for an anesthetic accident. The knee injury in Mexico had been just the first act of his elaborate performance. When confronted with this evidence, James's carefully maintained facade cracked. He leaped to his feet in the courtroom, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You were supposed to be my magnum opus," he shouted. "The perfect intersection of art and death. But you ruined everything with your miraculous survival and spiritual awakening nonsense." Sarah Mason crumbled under cross-examination. She revealed how James had seduced her, convincing her that they were creating revolutionary art that challenged the boundaries between life, death, and beauty. Their affair had begun not out of love, but as part of his methodical plot to have a reliable witness who would support the accident narrative. The most difficult moment came when they played the recording. James had accidentally left his camera running after the Mexico incident, capturing his conversation with Sarah as they watched me being loaded into the ambulance. "Don't worry," his voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. "Even if she survives this, we have the surgery backup plan. The insurance policy is ironclad." Throughout the proceedings, I maintained the inner peace I had found during my near-death experience. Even as James ranted about his artistic vision, even as Sarah tearfully confessed their schemes, I felt only compassion for their tortured souls. The divine love I had experienced in that realm of light encompassed even those who had tried to destroy me. My testimony focused not on revenge but on truth. I spoke about the transformation that had occurred during my near-death experience, about the understanding that all actions, even the darkest ones, ultimately serve our soul's evolution. Several jurors wept as I described choosing to return to life for my daughter's sake, despite knowing the challenges that awaited me. The moment of verdict arrived with a heavy silence. As the judge prepared to announce James's sentence, I felt a familiar presence. That same divine light that had embraced me during my near-death experience seemed to fill the courtroom. In that moment, I realized that this confrontation wasn't about punishment or justice in human terms. It was about bringing darkness into light, about transforming pain into understanding. James was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder and insurance fraud. As they led him away, our eyes met briefly. In that moment, I sent him a silent blessing, remembering what I had learned in that realm of light, that even the darkest soul carries a spark of divine love, waiting to be awakened. The day after James's sentencing, something extraordinary happened that would forever change the public perception of my story. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, my most vocal critic in the medical community, suffered a devastating car accident on his way to film a television segment debunking near-death experiences. His heart stopped for 4 minutes during emergency surgery. When he regained consciousness 3 days later, he requested to see me immediately. The man who had once called me a fraud was now in tears as he described experiencing the same realm of light I had encountered. He had seen the same loving beings, felt the same unconditional love, and received the same understanding about life's true purpose. His public statement sent shockwaves through the medical community. As a neurosurgeon, I spent my career dismissing near-death experiences as hallucinations, he announced at a packed press conference. I was wrong. What Diane Sherman has been describing is real, and it's time for medicine to expand its understanding of consciousness and healing. This validation from a respected medical professional opened floodgates. Other physicians began coming forward with their own stories of inexplicable healings they'd witnessed in their practices. The California Medical Board dropped their investigation into my work, and several major hospitals invited me to work alongside their traditional medical teams in a groundbreaking integration of spiritual and conventional healing. Sarah's role in this breakthrough was equally remarkable. During a particularly powerful healing session, she suddenly announced that she could see angels in the hospital room. Her childlike ability to perceive the spiritual realm, untainted by adult skepticism, provided a pure form of validation that even hardened critics found difficult to dismiss. Research institutions began documenting the effects of my healing work. The Stanford Institute for Consciousness Studies conducted a year-long investigation measuring quantifiable changes in patients' brainwaves, immune responses, and cellular regeneration during our sessions. The results were undeniable. Something profound was happening that defied conventional medical understanding. The media narrative shifted dramatically. The same publications that had once mocked my fall from fashion now celebrated my rise to spiritual healer. Television shows that had aired skeptical exposes now featured lengthy segments on the scientific evidence supporting my work. Even fashion magazines reached out, interested in exploring the connection between physical beauty and spiritual transformation. But the most significant breakthrough came through the healing center I established with Dr. Reynolds. We created a space where traditional medicine and spiritual healing could work in harmony, where doctors and healers collaborated rather than competed. The center became a model for a new paradigm of holistic healthcare, attracting patients and practitioners from around the world. Catherine joined the center's management team, using her business acumen to create a sustainable structure that could serve people regardless of their ability to pay. My father, fully embracing his renewed faith, became our spiritual director, helping patients and families navigate their own journeys of transformation. The center's success caught the attention of Sarah Mason, who reached out from her new life in Europe. Her letter of apology included a surprising revelation: she had experienced her own spiritual awakening after witnessing the power of truth in the courtroom. She asked to volunteer at the center as part of her own healing journey, a request that tested and ultimately confirmed my commitment to universal forgiveness. Medical schools began incorporating our findings into their curricula. The Sherman Protocol, as it became known, emphasized the integration of spiritual awareness with medical treatment. Young doctors trained at our center learned to recognize and honor the connection between physical healing and spiritual wholeness. What made this breakthrough especially powerful was its timing, coming immediately after James's trial. It transformed a story of betrayal and survival into one of healing and redemption. The public wasn't just witnessing my victory over those who had tried to destroy me, they were seeing the emergence of a new understanding of human potential and divine love. My father's diagnosis came during the height of our healing center's success. The irony wasn't lost on anyone here. I was known for miraculous healings, and yet powerless against the aggressive cancer spreading through my father's body. The doctors gave him 3 months. He lasted 6, every day a testament to the strength he'd finally found in his renewed faith. During those precious final months, we spent every evening together in his hospital room at our center. He insisted on staying there rather than a regular hospital, saying he could feel the presence of angels in our halls. Sarah would sit on his bed reading from his worn Bible, the same one he'd carried during his preaching days. Sometimes, when the pain wasn't too bad, he'd join her, his former preacher's voice giving new life to ancient words. One particularly lucid evening, he asked everyone else to leave the room. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The night your mother died, I was drunk again. She called for me, but I was passed out in my study by the time I found her." He broke down, decades of guilt pouring out. Through my new spiritual sensitivity, I could see the dark weight lifting from his soul as he finally shared this burden. I held his hand, feeling the divine light flow between us. "Dad," I said, "Mom forgives you. I saw her in that realm of light. There's no blame there, only love." His whole body shook with sobs, years of self-hatred dissolving in the face of unconditional forgiveness. That night marked a turning point, though his body continued to weaken, his spirit grew stronger. He began sharing stories from his early ministry days, before doubt and disillusionment had taken hold. He spoke of miraculous healings he'd witnessed but had been afraid to acknowledge, of spiritual experiences he'd dismissed as imagination. "I was so afraid of being called a fraud," he confessed, "that I became false to myself instead." Catherine discovered his old sermon notes in the attic of our childhood home. Reading them now, we saw how his early messages about divine love and spiritual healing aligned perfectly with what I'd experienced in my near-death journey. He had known these truths all along, but had buried them under layers of fear and social expectation. As the end drew near, something extraordinary happened. Patients began gathering outside his room, drawn by what they described as a powerful, peaceful presence. Even those who didn't know he was my father reported seeing a bright light around his door. He had become a beacon of the same divine love he had once preached about but forgotten. The night before he passed, he had a moment of perfect clarity. "I see them," he said, his eyes focused on something beyond the physical room. "The beings in light you described, they're here. And your mother, she's with them." Sarah, who had fallen asleep in the corner, suddenly sat up and pointed to the same empty space. "The angels are getting ready," she announced with a child's simple acceptance. He left us at dawn, just as the first light was breaking over Los Angeles. In his final moments, the room filled with that familiar divine presence I had encountered in my own near-death experience. Catherine felt it too, that same shared sensitivity we'd had since childhood, telling us that something sacred was unfolding. We found his Bible afterward, open to the passage he'd marked as his final message to us. "Perfect love casts out fear." Below it, he'd written his last words: "Diane, you brought me back to this truth. Your near death became my rebirth. Thank you for showing me the way home." The price of being a channel for divine healing wasn't immediately apparent. Like a slow tide, the toll it took on my physical and emotional well-being crept up gradually until it could no longer be ignored. The constant flow of others' pain through my system, while transformative for them, began to leave its mark on me. I started noticing the changes after particularly intense healing sessions. My hands would shake for hours, my body temperature would fluctuate wildly, and sometimes I'd be bedridden for days, unable to process the emotional residue of the suffering I'd absorbed. Catherine was the first to notice how my hair had begun graying rapidly, how deep lines had etched themselves around my eyes not from age, but from carrying the weight of countless souls' traumas. The hardest part was maintaining boundaries. When you can feel everyone's pain, how do you decide who to help? I would find myself drawn to strangers in grocery stores, on streets, in restaurants, each one carrying burdens that called out to my heightened sensitivity. There were nights I couldn't sleep, overwhelmed by the collective suffering that seemed to pulse through the walls of our healing center. Sarah, now 12, showed signs of inheriting my gift, which brought its own kind of maternal anguish. I'd find her crying over news stories about disasters halfway across the world, feeling the victim's pain as if it were her own. Teaching her to protect herself while remaining open to her gift became my most challenging balancing act. The medical team at our center, led by Dr. Reynolds, began documenting the physical effects of healing work on my body. During sessions, my heart rate would synchronize with the patient's, my brain waves would show patterns similar to deep meditation, and my immune system would temporarily weaken as if taking on their illness. The science confirmed what I already knew: this gift demanded payment in flesh and spirit. Some nights, alone in my room, I would remember the perfect peace of that realm of light I'd visited during my near-death experience. The contrast between that divine harmony and the chaotic suffering of earthly existence sometimes felt too stark to bear. Yet each morning I would rise and return to the work, knowing this was the path I'd chosen. Catherine became my guardian, forcing me to take breaks when she sensed I was reaching my limits. She instituted strict protocols at the center: no more than 3 intensive healing sessions per day, mandatory rest periods, and regular retreats where I could recharge in nature. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she would remind me, using our mother's old phrase with new understanding. The most unexpected cost was to my personal life. Dating proved nearly impossible. How do you explain to someone that their unresolved childhood trauma is screaming at you louder than their dinner conversation? Friends from my modeling days drifted away, uncomfortable with my ability to see through their carefully maintained facades. Even casual social interactions became exercises in emotional overload. Yet for all these costs, the rewards were immeasurable. Every life transformed, every soul awakened to their own divine connection. Every moment of genuine healing, these were worth every gray hair, every sleepless night, every ounce of energy expended. I learned to see my exhaustion as a sacred exhaustion, my sacrifice as a holy exchange. Through it all, I held on to the truth revealed during my near-death experience, that every moment of suffering contains within it the seed of divine love, waiting to be recognized and released. The cost of this gift became not a burden to bear, but a privilege to embrace, the privilege of being a bridge between human pain and divine healing. The letter arrived 5 years after James began serving his sentence. Written in the shaky handwriting of a dying man, it contained confessions that would shake our understanding of everything that had happened. James had terminal cancer, and in his final months he had decided to unveil the full scope of his crimes. The insurance fraud scheme, it turned out, went far beyond just me. James had been part of an international network of predators who targeted successful women in the fashion industry. They called themselves the Collectors, treating their victims' deaths as a form of performance art. Each murder was meticulously photographed, documented, and archived in a private gallery seen only by members of their twisted circle. Sarah Mason hadn't been just another victim of James's manipulation. She had been their talent scout, using her position as a trusted confidante to identify potential targets. Her betrayal of my friendship had been calculated from our very first meeting. The modeling agency where we'd met was actually a front for their organization, systematically grooming vulnerable women for what they called the final shoot. The FBI agent who brought me the letter, Agent Rebecca Torres, had been tracking the Collectors for a decade. "Your survival," she explained, "wasn't just miraculous, it was unprecedented. You were the first to break their perfect record, and your public transformation threatened their entire operation." The attempts to discredit my near-death experience and healing work hadn't just been about skepticism, they had been orchestrated by the organization to protect their ongoing schemes. In his confession, James revealed something that made my blood run cold. The day of my knee surgery, There had been 2 other members of the collectors present in the hospital disguised as medical staff. They had planned to ensure that if the anesthesia didn't kill me, other means would. What they hadn't counted on was the divine intervention that not only saved my life but transformed it. The most shocking revelation came in the form of a USB drive included with the letter. It contained files documenting decades of the collectors' activities, including evidence linking them to dozens of unsolved deaths in the fashion industry. Cases that had been dismissed as accidents, suicides, or natural causes were revealed as carefully orchestrated murders. Among the files was a folder labeled Eleanor Sherman. My mother's stroke, it seemed, hadn't been natural at all. The collectors had viewed my mother's death as a necessary step in isolating me for their final plan. The knowledge that both my parents had been victims of this organization brought a new dimension of understanding to their suffering and a deeper appreciation for the divine purpose that had brought me back to expose these crimes. As federal agents moved to arrest the remaining members of the collectors, former victims began coming forward. Women who had survived earlier attempts shared stories eerily similar to mine. Some had experienced their own spiritual awakenings in the aftermath of their near deaths, though none had developed the healing abilities that had manifested in me. Sarah Mason, facing new charges based on James's confession, finally broke her silence completely. In a televised interview from prison, she revealed the inner workings of the collectors' network, including their connections to prominent figures in the fashion and art worlds. Her testimony would eventually lead to the exposure of corruption reaching into the highest levels of the industry. The truth had emerged not just as a matter of justice, but as a demonstration of divine timing. Each revelation served to validate the spiritual transformation that had occurred through my near-death experience. The very forces that had tried to destroy me had ultimately served to prove the reality of divine intervention and the power of spiritual healing. The exposure of the collectors became a catalyst for profound change, not just in my life but in the entire fashion industry. Our healing center transformed into something far more expansive, a sanctuary for survivors of abuse and exploitation in the modeling world. Women who had been silenced for years found their voices within our walls, their healing journeys becoming testaments to the power of divine love over human darkness. Major modeling agencies underwent intense scrutiny, leading to a complete overhaul of industry practices. I was invited to speak at the United Nations about human trafficking in the fashion industry, sharing both my personal story and the larger spiritual awakening it had triggered. The superficial world that had once celebrated only physical beauty was being forced to confront its soul. Sarah Mason's public confession led to an unexpected development. From her prison cell, she began experiencing her own spiritual awakening. Through letters and monitored phone calls, she described visions similar to what I had experienced during my near-death experience. When she requested to become part of our healing work, even Catherine was skeptical. But I remembered what I had learned in that realm of light, that transformation is possible for every soul. We established a program specifically for industry survivors, with Sarah contributing through recorded sessions from prison. Her insights into the psychology of predators like the collectors proved invaluable in helping other women recognize and escape similar situations. The woman who had once aided in my attempted murder was now helping to save lives. The medical community's interest in our work expanded beyond just physical healing. Researchers began studying the relationship between trauma, spiritual awakening, and transformation. Our center became a hub for integrating traditional therapy with spiritual healing, drawing practitioners from various faiths and disciplines who recognize the universal truth underlying all genuine healing. Sarah, my daughter, emerged as a bridge between generations. Now a teenager, she worked with children of trafficking survivors, her natural gift for spiritual perception helping young souls process their inherited trauma. Watching her work, I often saw echoes of that divine light I'd encountered during my near-death experience, proof that heaven's touch can ripple through generations. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurred within the fashion industry itself. Major magazines began featuring stories of survival and spiritual awakening alongside their usual fashion spreads. Runway shows incorporated elements of healing and empowerment. The industry that had once been a hunting ground for predators like the collectors was becoming a platform for positive change. Catherine expanded our program internationally, establishing satellite centers in major fashion capitals: Paris, Milan, New York. Each location served as both a healing center and an educational facility, teaching young models about spiritual protection and authentic empowerment. The industry's next generation would be armed with both inner awareness and practical knowledge. I found myself returning to modeling, but with a completely different purpose. Instead of selling clothes, I was now demonstrating what true beauty looks like, the beauty of a soul fully aligned with its divine purpose. Photography sessions became opportunities for healing, as I worked only with photographers committed to capturing authentic spiritual radiance rather than manufactured perfection. The transformation extended to unexpected places. Some of the very people who had once tried to discredit my near-death experience and healing work became our strongest allies. Dr. Reynolds continued his research, publishing papers that built bridges between scientific understanding and spiritual reality. Even former members of the Collectors, facing justice, began seeking spiritual counseling. This period of transformation proved what I had learned in that realm of light, that darkness cannot exist where light chooses to shine, and that every soul, no matter how lost, carries within it the potential for divine awakening. The fashion industry, once a symbol of superficial beauty, was being reformed into a channel for authentic spiritual expression. 20 years have passed since my near-death experience on that operating table, and the legacy of what began as personal trauma has blossomed into something far greater than I could have imagined. Our healing center, once a small refuge in Los Angeles, has grown into an international network of spiritual wellness centers, each carrying forward the message that divine love can transform even the deepest wounds. Sarah, my daughter, now runs our youth program, her own gift for healing having matured into something even more powerful than mine. At 32, she possesses a wisdom that transcends her years, helping a new generation understand the connection between physical, emotional, and spiritual healing. The blood disorder that once threatened her life has become part of her testimony, a living proof that divine intervention isn't just a story, but a tangible reality. Catherine has become a renowned speaker on spiritual transformation in business, showing corporate leaders how authentic spirituality can transform toxic industries. She often jokes that our childhood ability to sense incoming storms prepared us perfectly for navigating the complex waters of global change. Our shared sensitivity, once a burden, has become a gift we use to guide others toward their own awakening. The fashion industry itself stands as perhaps our greatest legacy. What was once a breeding ground for predators like the Collectors has become a leading voice for spiritual authenticity. Major fashion houses now include spiritual wellness programs for their models, and our healing protocol is standard training in modeling agencies worldwide. The transformation has been so complete that it's hard to remember the darkness that once lurked behind the glamour. Our work with survivors continues to evolve. We've documented thousands of cases of spiritual awakening following trauma, creating a body of evidence that even the most skeptical scientists cannot ignore. Dr. Reynolds, before his retirement, established a research foundation dedicated to understanding the connection between near-death experiences and healing abilities. His work has helped bridge the gap between spiritual experience and scientific understanding. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy exists in the quiet moments in the letters I receive from women who found their way back to life through our programs, in the faces of children who no longer carry their parents' trauma, in the transformed lives of those who once thought themselves beyond redemption. Even Sarah Mason, serving her final years in prison, has become a powerful voice for change, counseling other inmates through their own spiritual awakening. What began with my desperate prayer in a hospital chapel has grown into a movement that touches lives across the globe. The divine light I encountered during my near-death experience continues to shine through every program we create, every life we touch, every soul that finds its way to healing. We've proven that trauma, while painful, can be a doorway to profound spiritual transformation. Recently, I discovered my father's old Bible, the one he used during his final days. In it, he had underlined a passage that seems to perfectly capture our legacy: perfect love casts out fear. Through all our programs and initiatives, this remains our core message, that divine love, once truly experienced, has the power to transform every darkness into light. As I sit here in my meditation room, overlooking the healing gardens of our center, I reflect on the extraordinary journey that brought me from the glittering world of high fashion to this place of profound purpose. The divine light I encountered during my near-death experience never left me. It simply found new ways to express itself through every challenge and triumph that followed. The truth I've come to understand is both simple and revolutionary. We are not here to suffer. The pain we experience, whether physical or emotional, is not a punishment but an invitation to deeper awakening. My own journey from abused child to superficial model to attempted murder victim to spiritual healer stands as testimony that every dark night of the soul carries within it the seeds of divine transformation. To those who still doubt the reality of spiritual experience, I offer not arguments but evidence: thousands of documented healings, countless transformed lives, and a reformed industry that once profited from human exploitation. Science may not yet have all the tools to measure divine love, but its effects are undeniable. As Dr. Reynolds often says, the absence of scientific explanation does not negate the presence of genuine healing. The fashion world taught me about the power of appearance, but my near-death experience revealed the true nature of beauty. It's not found in perfect features or designer clothes, but in the radiance of a soul awakening to its divine purpose. Every person who comes to our centers carries this innate beauty. It simply needs the right conditions to shine through. To those walking through their own valleys of shadow, I offer this truth: you are infinitely more loved than you can imagine. The same divine light that saved me on that operating table surrounds you now, waiting to be recognized. Your trauma, your pain, your struggles are not the end of your story. They may be the beginning of your greatest transformation. The collectors sought to turn death into art, but they failed to understand that true beauty lies in the triumph of life over death, of love over fear, of truth over deception. Their dark legacy has been transformed into a light that now guides others toward healing. Even in our deepest wounds, we can find purpose if we're willing to let divine love lead the way. As I approach my 60th year, I find myself filled not with regret for what was lost, but with gratitude for what was found. Every scar, every gray hair, every line on my face tells a story of transformation. The former model who once chased perfection now knows that true beauty emerges only when we embrace our complete human experience: light and shadow, joy and pain, life and death. This is my final message to all who hear my story: trust the light within you. It knows the way home. Whether you find it through trauma or grace, through loss or love, that divine spark is your truest self. Let it guide you. Let it transform you. Let it shine through you until you become what you were always meant to be: a living testimony to the power of divine love. Thank you for watching this powerful story of transformation and divine love. If you've been touched by Diane's journey from darkness to light, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with spiritual awakening or healing. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of near-death experiences and spiritual transformations. By subscribing, you support our team in bringing these important messages to a wider audience. If you found value in this video, please hit the like button and share it with friends and family who might need to hear this message of hope and healing. Every share helps spread the light of divine love to someone who might be walking through their own valley of shadows. Together, we can create a community of understanding and support. Thank you for being part of this journey.